just can't see them, even if they're flagrant. And you need to get away from it for at least a couple of weeks before you could even hope to spot some of those errors. And the nice thing is when you're not a student, when you're faculty and you have months, semesters to years to work on these papers, you can walk away for a month, 2 months, pretty easy.
I will say that I took a class with Schweig last spring,
Mm-hmm.
and he didn't put my grade in until like October, so you could make the due date like October 1st.
Yeah, that's not my style. That Schweig can get away with that. I wouldn't try to get away with that. All right. Well, as I promised, today will be a session that focuses on our papers. Wednesday will be our final session where we will have a student-led discussion of Book 13. Let me find the rubric. Pretty sure I stuck it under here. Oh, did I not give you a rubric? No, let me look somewhere else. Let me look under assignment or something. Yeah, here it is. I stuck it under assignment. I was going to say bad professor. All right, here we go. All right, so what is Professor Silverman looking for and looking at when he grades your papers? You can turn around and look at what I've got up here, or you can pull this, download it yourself off the Scholar site under assignments, not under readings. And some of these should be pretty easy. So the first two categories for 10 points each, how relevant and important is the topic for 10 points, and how clear is the thesis. I still get papers and even senior defenses sometimes where in the senior defense, the person will argue for a position that does not match the purported thesis of the actual paper. So this is why we have a sort of paper topic and thesis assignment at the beginning of our paper. So I can give you feedback and say that's still not a thesis, or that topic is going to be hard to research, or that's not really a proper kind of topic for this class. So per topic, I think all of you are on a pretty good path. Otherwise, you wouldn't have gotten to this stage. I wouldn't have proved your topic. Thesis, again, make sure your thesis is clear. Somewhere, and I'm going to blame the English department for stuff like this, somewhere people got the idea that being indirect in the way that you present your thesis is somehow a virtue. Well, at the very least in philosophy, it's not a virtue. I should not have any doubt what your thesis is. And if you say in your paper, this paper's thesis is colon, and then state the thesis, that is perfectly 100% acceptable. And it's far better than me having to hunt for the thesis. The traditional place to put a thesis is at the end of the second paragraph, the introduction. I do not have a ban on using personal pronouns in these papers. I recommend you use them sparingly with caution, but one very natural place to use a personal pronoun is to say, my thesis is. I have no problem with that. Now, if you use more than 10 personal pronouns in the paper, maybe we need to talk, and maybe you need to go back to that 0 personal pronouns, because you're overdoing it. But yeah, there's nothing, in philosophy, there's no magic ban on personal pronouns. It's also important to revisit your thesis at the end of your paper writing project. And make sure that the thesis you initially started with is what the paper matches. Now, if you put a ton of work into something and your thesis and your paper don't match, at that point, it's probably easier to tweak your thesis than to rewrite the entire paper. Now, of course, it depends. I mean, if your paper goes in multiple directions, then you've got a problem. But and here's something that can happen. Let's say you're investigating a topic. Let's say the topic is, I don't know, what's a topic that someone might write about that isn't super controversial? Here, marginal tax rates. There's something that you all are young enough, you don't pay high taxes, so you won't get too upset about this. So let's say at the beginning of the paper writing process, you want to argue that my thesis is marginal tax rates should be higher than they are by at least 3%. And you do all your research. So one of my big pet peeves is professors that lock you into a thesis before you've done your research. Does that sound like something we should be teaching you to do? It doesn't sound like something that I think we should be teaching you to do. If after doing your research, you say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Silverman. I thought they needed to be higher, but they're already kind of high. I mean, 40% just federal income tax. That sounds high to me. Shouldn't be higher than that." So what do you do in that situation? Well, it's not a big deal. You just say, okay, well, you use all the same information. You use most of the arguments. You just sort of tweak the direction of them, and you just say, the tax rate should be lower. And no harm, no foul, no big deal. So it is okay to revise your thesis at the end if the research warrants it. So here, let me admit to something embarrassing, and I hate the fact that this will be on YouTube. I will take this down shortly. There was one paper I was writing about Augustine, and I had an important point from this Augustine, writing that I'd never used before. Because as I've told you before, there's 100 of them, more than 100. Nobody's read them all. A scholar like me knows maybe 10 of them not. And about 6 weeks before going to final publication, I stumbled across the pseudo-Augustinian writings. So there are what are called pseudepigraphal writings. When someone is writing pseudepigraphally, it means that they themselves did not claim to be the author. They probably, in an effort to give the book more credibility, attributed it to somebody other than themselves. And I almost put this important quote from a pseudepigraphal writing that wasn't really from Augustine, just something that claimed to be from Augustine. And I was very glad that I caught that and I rooted that out. So all that to say, keep doing your research. There's no shame in tweaking. If your research doesn't support what you think, that's okay. Just tweak the thesis. All right. After the introduction, most people are good on those first two sections. By the way, introductions should generally be short. They should be a page and a half. If you go more than 2 pages, you're wasting space. Maybe intentionally. Also, in philosophy papers, it is completely acceptable, and often most of us view it as praiseworthy, if you use strong section breaks. So what I mean by that is this. You might, at the beginning of your paper, just write the words intro, up in the upper left. Yeah, I know the beginning's the intro. You probably don't need it right there. But the next section is generally called the exposition. So if after a page or a half or so, when you're done with your introduction and you're bridging into the meatier part of the paper, you want to do a solid, bold, new subheading, call it exposition, more power to you. And in that exposition, which I've sort of put there in parentheses for you, your main job is to explain the context of your debate. In other words, why should I give a damn about this debate? And you generally have to define your key terms. You have to define your key terms because some words are very equivocal. Here's one. God. I mean, do we mean, by God, do we mean, do we mean Zeus? Do we mean a generic, all-powerful, omnipotent, omnipresent being? Do we mean specifically the Christian triune deity? What do we want to specifically argue for specific attributes or leave certain attributes off? In one of my favorite books about God, Richard Swinburne's The Existence of God, he takes a page and a half of exposition to define what he means by God. And he does that because he wants to argue for very specific traits and avoid certain traits that are commonly associated with God that he doesn't think belongs to the concept. You want to give us some history to the debate. I mean, presumably you're not the first person to be concerned with evil or sexuality or the relationship between church and state or whatever it is you're writing about. So, we don't want a lot of history, but, up to a page of just sort of context. Who's been arguing about this? Why? What's at stake? What happens if we get to one point or the other point? A lot of papers don't feel very important because they never tell me anything's at stake. Yeah, sometimes we all know what's at stake, but it's part of a paper writing discipline to explicitly state what is at stake. What's at stake? You need to define your key terms. When you define your terms, don't just make up a definition. And don't just go to Wikipedia or online Webster's or something like that. Go to a philosophically, theologically authoritative source. So if we want to talk about Augustine, we might want to say what Augustine means by God is, and then quote, like 2 sentences where he gives a description of God. I mean, there's many places that he does it. In the Confessions, it makes sense. And then you might want to explain, some more about it. If you don't want Augustine, how about the Nicene Creed, which we've talked about in class as, what defined Christian orthodoxy for his time. Or if you don't like that, you can cite something from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So not just some generic dictionary, a philosophical dictionary. It makes a big difference. Because, Wikipedia doesn't know what free will is. In philosophy, we have like 5 different kinds of free will that we talk about, and they're not all identical to each other. So define your terms, define them wisely, use the term consistently in line with how you've defined it, which frankly is a mistake that I sometimes find people make, is they define it a specific way, and then they revert to just generic, sloppy usage of the term throughout the paper. And again, free will is one that I see happen with a lot because there's multiple views on free will. All right, next section. The heart of your paper is your arguments for your thesis, which are worth 40 points in the rough draft and 30 points in the final draft. And of course, an argument isn't just your opinion. Even if an argument is your reflections on something, you want to give reasons that motivate your reflections that would make somebody who isn't already on board with your position more likely to embrace it. So who is your target audience with your arguments? Your target audience should be someone who understands the debates, or at least is sort of generally smart enough to understand the debate, generally philosophically trained, is sort of ambivalent on the issue. You don't have to assume somebody's sort of a dug-in opponent of your view, but you also don't want to assume that they're particularly sympathetic towards the view. That's the person that you want to be able to persuade. Because in part, the person who's already with you, you don't need to persuade. And the person who hates your position isn't going to be persuaded. And it's a waste of time to be lobbing, shooting that high. That's too high of a standard. That's an unreasonable expectation. But you want good arguments that might move somebody, even if it doesn't fully convince them, would make them more amenable to your arguments. And usually it's arguments. Usually you have at least 3 main points in favor of your position. Now I say usually because of this. Sometimes you only have one argument, and it's a really good one, and it's kind of an original one. In which case, okay, but in that case you better go really in depth. So again, you want the arguments to be consistent. You want them to be sustained. At the same time, you don't want to be redundant with the arguments. Going deep into an argument isn't just saying the same thing with different wording again and again. Going deep into an argument is giving you multiple reasons and nuances to why you might think it would be true. All right, then for our final draft, we add objections and responses. And usually, we want to find the best argument or two against the argument you are making. So here is the smartest way to defeat an opponent. In your own paper, you want to have already identified the best argument against yours and already addressed it. Your objections and responses, again, like your definitions, you shouldn't just pull them out of the air. The best ones are when you cite and quote someone specific who's made this point. And the best objections are when you get someone really smart and really good who's made the objection, someone who's respected. So don't get these from some stupid guy out on the internet who happens to have a website. You want these from, real philosophers, real theologians, people who are respected and have a following and an influence. And you want to do your best, of course, to not just raise the objection and raise it accurately as the opponent might raise it, but you want to do something to disarm it. Now, if the best you can do is give some evidence against it, that's okay. I mean, if that's honestly the best you can do. The more common mistake is to be just utterly dismissive of somebody's really good objection, or to not really find a good objection. This shows a lack of awareness of the literature and the grounds of the debate. And that makes you look much worse than if you raise an objection and then just garner a little evidence against the objection. And then the only thing in the paper that doesn't have a specific section that grades it with a point attached is the conclusion. And the conclusion just summarizes what you've done. If your conclusion's more than a page, you're taking way too long to conclude. I mean, really what you should do is in the conclusion, you should just take your, this was my topic, this was my thesis, these were my main points. So this is the classic paper writing technique. In the introduction, I will tell you what I'm about to tell you. In the exposition and argument, I tell you what I told you I was going to tell you. In exposition and objections and responses, I bring up objections to what I told you. And then in conclusions, I reminded you what I told you throughout. So I kind of give my main point 3 times. Sort of broad grading issues, internal coherence and consistency. Some people just, are inconsistent within their own argument, within their own viewpoint, within their use of language. Content accuracy. Sometimes people claim things that ain't true. Or maybe are true but are disputable and they just don't know it or they just don't acknowledge it. And quality of sources and references. Again, this is why we had a bibliography assignment. So you should all have reasonably good quality of sources and references. Obviously, this is an Augustine course. In general, we expect that you're going to use some primary Augustine sources. But secondary sources, again, especially secondary scholars writing about Augustine, are worthwhile, and so forth. All right, so this again is my annual reminder of what I expect in a paper, for-year paper due in 4 days. Yes?
Do you expect a bibliography or a references in that? Do you want us to cite everything that we read or just cite things that are specifically quoted?
I'm going to leave that up to which style you choose to use because there are different stylistic expectations. Here's my thing. I care that you don't plagiarize, and I care that you use primary sources. And I like it if you also use secondary sources. I probably don't care quite as much. But those are the three things I care about. I don't really care which footnoting, bibliography, works cited version you do. So use the one that you're most used to using, that is most comfortable for you, or that you think, if this is a second major for you, use the one from your primary major. Because I don't care. I mean, why burden you with that? That doesn't benefit you. It doesn't benefit me. So, good question. All right, this being said, how do you all feel about your papers? The smarter students realize that this is an invitation to have me help write their papers.
I like this flow, and I try to make all of my papers like this, but in writing about the free will defense and the privation theory of evil, it's like the part of my paper that's about the free will defense is kind of a conglomerate of objection and argument.
Right. In part because what you have is what's called a negative thesis.
Yes.
So your thesis is that your thesis is that a certain argument that you're engaging doesn't work. So yeah, how do you work in objections and responses to that? Generally, what you need to do is you need to get into the literature in the articles that are written, because it's pretty. The free will defense has been criticized, and people like Plantinga have written a ton trying to respond to the critics of the free will defense. So for the objections, you want to get the responses to your objections. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So here, the exposition is kind of what the free will defense is. Your argument is what's wrong with the free will defense. The objection is the attempt to defend the defense against your criticism, and your response is the attempt to refute the defense of the defense.
Got it.
And if you can keep that thread straight, that's like an extra couple points right there. Just for keeping track of who's defending what, where, who's on first.
You're all wrong.
Oh, too easy. Other thoughts? How are we doing?
Just a question on, I the way I organized my essay was I literally had section titles.
Sure.
Do you care about that, or do you not care about that?
Well, I mean, does it kind of fit into this pattern, or is it very different from this pattern?
It's kind of that pattern, but the third section is split into a lot of sections.
Sure.
I feel like my arguments are individual sections.
Sure. So really, you could even do like 3.1, 3.2, 3.3. I mean, I'm not a heavily analytic style writer, but the more subheadings and like nested bullet points you use, the easier these things are to read, strangely enough. I don't care if you title them stuff as long as I can figure out what you're doing. I don't care about subtitles. I mean, here's the trick. If you come up with something very clever, I mean, you know, it's like being pulled over by a cop. If you make the cop laugh, you know that's to your advantage.
My other question is kind of a question of advice, more so, because I am taking a very, very concrete issue, which is like teenage depression rates,
Sure.
phone use, contemporary culture, influence on that,
Yeah.
and involving that with philosophy of sin.
Yeah.
What you have any advice for kind of better transitioning a connection between those? Because it's very back and forth.
Yeah. So the challenge of your topic is this. What you really are doing is you're investigating a topic that there really needs to be like a course on, or that should be like a subspecialization within either theology or psychology, certainly. So the danger is what you're doing is really, really big. Or at least it connects with really, really big things. So what you want to say is the topic of sin is really big, and depression is really, really big. And in a fallen world, we would expect depression to be a consequence of a fallen world, both just for being a person who happens to be in a corrupted world, A, and perhaps B, sometimes the result of your own or other people's bad choices. As the bumper sticker goes, everything happens for a reason. Sometimes the reason we are foolish and make bad decisions. So I would start with that sort of framing, but then I would say, I want to just focus on 3 or 4 or 5 or however many contemporary aspects of teenage life that connect sin and depression that somehow relate to Augustine. Not really sure how social media use is going, how you're going to make the argument of social media use, but have at it. But surely there's an argument that being too materialistic or too ambitious, too concerned with worldly success, or too lustfully preoccupied, there's definitely an argument that these things are all bad for us, and that they might, if you could demonstrate that they result in a correlation with depression, that would be a really interesting Augustinian style thing to prove. For the record, for things like that, I'm probably more interested in you going a little deeper on something like 3 than doing like 5 or 6 and just giving a little bit. So deeper is always better than broader on things like that. When you're doing a 15-page paper, deeper is always better than broader. When you're doing a 200-page book, broader becomes really attractive. But you don't want to spread yourself so thin that you really need 50 pages to cover it. Anyone else? John?
I have a part in my paper where I try and explain the free will defense through social psychology. Is that worth doing at all, or should I just try and find another way?
The honest answer is I have no idea. Tell me about social psychology and how it explains the free will defense.
Well, I just tried going into how interactions between people and how we perceive certain moral things through social psychology. And,
I mean, surely there's something to be said for it is good that people have free will and can choose things, and it would be really bad if somehow it proves that it would be really bad if people didn't have free will, or it would be very bad for us to like micromanage other people's thoughts so much that they no longer have free will, which is something I always think of when people talk about microaggressions. I'm like, that sounds a lot like thought crimes, which I read about in Orwell. I don't think that's a good thing. So there's that, or maybe you could go the opposite way. Maybe you could say psychology shows we don't really have free will anyway. So what good is a free will defense? So I mean, so yes, definitely psychology has some relevance, something to say concerning free will. And actually here, perhaps you'll forgive me if I do a not particularly humble brag, but this just came out today. I am on an interdisciplinary project where I worked on a psychology, theology, philosophy project where we came up with a scale for the relationship to measure the relationship between character development and one's experience of suffering. And you can see I'm not really very important on this particular one because I'm the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 6th out of 7 authors. So, it means I gave my opinion on a draft and, had some of the initial, I spoke to certain things in it, but no, I wasn't that important to it. Still, it was fun. I mean, if anyone's interested in this, for some reason I can send this around. I don't think this is relevant to any of your particular projects. All right, Grant, you're the only one who hasn't really gone.
Oh, yeah. This is just a really random question. I'm looking at my paper right now, and there were a couple times when I used, okay, this is not really big picture stuff, but I used like a word, like I was trying to bring attention to a word, and I was like, here's an example. I was explaining how Augustine would have considered himself a Platonist, not a Neoplatonist, because it wasn't there yet. And so I put Platonist in parentheses. No, in quotation.
Right.
Is that the right thing to do? Or should I put it
Yeah, that one's a little tricky because putting something in quotes usually means that you don't think it's a very good example of it.
Okay.
And I don't think that's quite fair to say that Augustine is kind of a fake Platonist, which is kind of what it means when you put it in quotes.
Oh, okay. So that's not what I meant.
So like if I say I'm going to introduce this expert. All right, see you all have a proper reaction. So when you put something in quotes, you it indicates non-standard use. So Augustine is within the standard words. So you might, one thing you could do is you just could do a 1-sentence footnote early on and say, I'm going to use the word Platonist for Augustine, or I'm going to use the word Neoplatonist for Augustine. And, he would have thought of himself as a Platonist, even though, we today don't think he's, we think he's a couple steps removed.
Okay.
And there's good reasons we think he's a couple steps removed. I mean, he's a better Platonian than he is a Platonist, in part because he's reading a lot more Plotinus than he is Plato. In his day, there was only 1 or 2 dialogues that were fully translated and available in the Latin. Now, I mean, there were important quotes and principles that were known, but yeah. But basically, he's getting most of his Plato through sort of censored through Plotinus.
Okay. Another question about that. I don't know if you know the answer to this. This is also kind of for another paper, but also this paper. I guess you look at the roots of like Christian Platonism, it kind of starts with Philo the Jew, that's not Christian, but Judeo-Christian.
Sure.
It kind of maybe starts around then. Would he have read him in like Origen and Clement? Did they have Plato? Because didn't Neoplatonism start in the 3rd century? So they wouldn't have had Plotinus, but they would have had knowledge of Plato's works.
You mean Clement?
Clement, yes.
Yeah, there's other people before Plotinus that are Neoplatonists. Porphyry is the first one that comes to mind.
Okay.
And there are other people between Plato and Porphyry that sort of increasingly move towards what Plotinus says and away from what Plato says. I mean, honestly, I don't know more of the details than I've given. I don't know who Philo reads. I don't know who Clement reads. Now, if they're working in Greek rather than Latin, they probably have access to most of the Platonic corpus directly.
Okay.
So one of the key questions I would ask is, does this person work in Greek or in Latin?
Okay.
Or both? See, one of the things that's terrible that we know about Augustine is that he works in Latin and he doesn't like Greek very explicitly, which is a really kind of a bummer thing for a Christian New Testament guy to not like, especially if you're going to be as important as Augustine. But because that means he can't work in the original language. So in that sense, Augustine is behind our average garden variety pastor in the 21st century. But yeah, so I don't know off the top of my head enough about Philo and Clement and the others.
Okay. I guess it doesn't really matter to my view, but I guess not that much changes either necessarily. I know the Neoplatonists have more of a focus on like the one, maybe the metaphysics are a little more fleshed out, but I guess okay. So that's all I really had to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't. I mean, I think it's interesting to read Plotinus and then read Augustine because you can see he just so flagrantly defaults to so many Platinian things. I mean, it's kind of disturbing speaking as a religious guy. But I don't know how much is actually at stake most of the time. I mean, because, Plato and Plotinus both don't like material things. Both think material things drag us down. Both think the soul is where purity is and the true self is. These sorts of very practical, important things. So on the broad strokes, they're functionally the same. But there are certain very specific things where there's a difference. And I don't think it usually matters. But it'd be really cool if you found a point where it did matter. And I'm sure somebody who really specialized in this for years could find something. But I'm too focused on contemporary ethics and contemporary philosophy of religion to invest myself that much in it. Anything else? Anyone else?
I think go out of microwave a burrito, so I think the even eat them.
I love that question. Thank you, Homer Simpson. Of course, this is a contemporary version of the paradox of the stone. Can God create a stone so big or so heavy that even he can't lift it? There are two answers. One that I really like, even though I don't really believe it, and one that I think is actually the correct answer. So first I'm going to use the one that I really like, even though I don't think it's the correct answer to it. But it's by one of my favorite people, Harry Frankfurt, who is a sort of a Jewish, contemporary Jewish philosopher. I met him once. It was like the coolest thing ever. I was like total fanboy. But yeah, his explanation was this. Well, people think this paradox exists because they don't understand how omnipotence works. So here's how omnipotence works. God can do a miracle. So you want God to commit a miracle, and you want him to create a rock so big that has the trait even God can't lift it, right? All right, watch God, and he will do a miracle. He will harness his omnipotence. Imagine Superman getting an extra dose of the yellow sun and doing something really, really impressive. And he can create this rock that has the trait cannot be lifted by God. Okay, so now we're worried because now it looks like there's something God can't do, right? There's this rock that has the trait cannot be lifted by God. But you know what? God has this thing, it's called omnipotence. And omnipotence means God can do things that normally can't be done. So God's going to lift that, God's going to walk up to that rock, and he's going to trigger omnipotence, and all of a sudden, God's going to do a miracle, and he will be able to lift the rock that has the trait cannot be lifted by God. Bam! No problem. Now, that's not my answer, but I think there's something really cool about that answer.
Can I give a better answer?
Okay, maybe you give the answer that I would give.
God can only do logically possible things.
Yeah.
Period.
So I mean, that's the Aquinas answer. That omnipotence is limited by. To be omnipotent means you have all power, but to have all power doesn't mean you can do things that are impossible. You can't make a circle. You can't turn a circle into a square, or create a really good tasting diet cola, or make 4 = 5. I mean, things that are incoherent are impossible. So the concept of a rock that can't be lifted by God, a rock by definition is a finite thing. All finite things can be lifted by God. So that's closer to the answer I would give. But I really like the idea of God just triggering miraculous omnipotence and being able to do things that he shouldn't be able to do. I should have asked him about that when I met him. But I would have come across as even more of a fanboy than I did. All right, on that note, let's call it a day. You're going to cover us for Wednesday. Ooh, wait a second. I'm going to make a request. I checked my IDEA response rate, and only 1 person out of 6 in this class has given me, an evaluation. So this worries me, because that gives that person 100% of control over what the administration thinks of the quality of this class. So you 4 are actually here. Please make sure you, fill that out.
I don't think I got the link for your class. Like when I open the IDEA link, only 3 of my.
It should be there.
This is the first time it's ever happened.
Yeah.
Oh, well, you fill it out then.
It should be.
I guess I'll be mad.
I mean, so.
Just leave it.
I can definitely say I've complained about enough professors and not seen any change, but I don't think people read these things. And you can't convince me otherwise.
Well, let me tell you the truth. It matters a little. And when someone already has tenure, like myself, it matters a little. When someone is pre-tenure, it matters more. If someone is annual contract, it matters more. If someone is an adjunct, it matters a lot. So basically, the less the university has invested in someone, the more important these are. The more they've already, I've already passed muster, and they already, either I've already proven myself, or more cynically, they've already invested too much in me to painlessly let me go. It matters. It could affect my merit raise by about a fraction of a percent, which to a guy like me matters, because that's like 1 extra meal out. But yeah, so that's the truth. So if y'all could make sure you fill those out, that'd be great. Thank you. And Grant, I will let you know whenever there's something to know.
That'd be great, yeah.
Who's missing today? We should